everybody, so welcome to another video, and this time we'll be talking about Iron Man numbers 292 to 309, which are more of Len Kaminski's Iron Man. This is actually the next 18 issues of his run, and then when we get back to this next time around with Hands of the Mandarin, that'll be the last 18 issues of his run. So surprisingly, he had a pretty extensive run. I always figured he had less than 30 issues, but evidently not. Now, I mentioned before that the 90s-isms of the run sometimes get in the way, even though it's otherwise really brilliant stuff. And I think that's most evident here. I want to go ahead and get right into it by saying I don't like the way Kaminski writes Rhodey. Now, I'm not sure if this is a Marvel mandate or if it was his idea, but essentially what happened with the first arc that I think I already talked about is Rhodey got spun off as War Machine in his own title, which is not written by Kaminski. And here he makes a couple of appearances, and issue 309 actually ends with Rhodey and Iron Man about to go to war, and it feels really forced. Rhodey used to be written as this kind of almost more Tony Stark than Tony Stark kind of character. The way Robert Downey Jr. plays Tony Stark is actually more accurate to how Rhodey was written prior to this run than it is to how Iron Man was written consistently from his inception to now, or to this particular set of issues. And that personality just got completely dropped the moment Kaminski took over. Now, granted, it was getting a little bit more serious around the John Byrne era, but he was still kind of jokey and flirty and fun. And I get why he has a beef with Tony. We covered that whole thing where he fakes his death previously, and that's enough to kind of to break the loyalty of most people. But at the same time, it seems like they should have just been able to either bury the hatchet or Rhodey should have been able to move on. He's just so completely consumed and angry, and it's extremely unlike him. So every time Rhodey shows up and he's just ranting and raving and acting like an insane man, I can't help but think he's out of character. The other big 90s thing here is the whole cyberspace angle. The last few issues have Tony link his mind into the internet, and he has like this whole digital battle with a digital entity, and the entity's called a Vortex. And then Vortex gets to have control of Tony's body while Tony's trapped in a different suit of armor, and they have a pretty interesting battle. And reading this actually gives you more of an appreciation of why cyberspace and stuff like the Matrix was so successful in the 90s, because it was on everyone's mind, and it even creeps in here, and I think arguably it works better here than it does in most places. Because they do a really interesting thing with emotions. Because when Vortex jumps into Tony's body, he gets to experience emotions, and when Tony's trapped in cyberspace, he doesn't have any. He's constantly moving around and floating and trying to figure things out, but he's very cerebral about it. It's not a matter of how he feels, and he's not angry, and he's constantly saying that I should feel like this, and I ought to be doing this, and I should have this type of frustration, and it never clicks in him. He's just completely a thought personality as opposed to something with feeling. And then Vortex, while he's trapped in Tony's body, starts giving into human urges. He starts acting a little bit like a barbarian. The first thing he does is drinks a whole bunch of alcohol, and then he tries to rape Tony's girlfriend, and that doesn't go in his favor. But he's very animalistic. He's very barbaric. And I think that's an interesting place to start, or an interesting place to end a lot of this, because the opening of these particular issues deal with Tony thinking about whether or not he's more machine than man. Ever since he got through the whole wheelchair thing, ever since having the chip installed in his back and having his brain treated like a computer, and rebooting himself and installing other chips to reprogram the way his body works, he's starting to feel less like a person. And those issues conclude with the basic idea that it's not our rationality that makes us people, it's our emotions and our ability to understand and control them. And it's not about just acting on drives, but being able to weigh in different spheres of influence how much our emotions matter. and that's a great place to take Tony, considering just how far lost he got with the end of Michelini Layton and John Byrne stuff, where the wheelchair thing just became this whole melodrama, and it was really hard to like Tony's character because he became so selfish about it, and now he's kind of a little bit more enlightened. I mentioned Tony's new love interest here. He has a physical therapist who's really pushy and really bossy, but she's secretly in love with him, and that whole love story just doesn't play for me. The way Vortex tries to rape her, then she runs away, and then they're just like, it's over, Tony, and I don't know, it was handled way too quickly. It was just not given enough weight. It just didn't feel natural enough, and that's my other big criticism with this run. But we do get the return of Bethany Cade in these particular set of issues. She's actually back a little bit earlier, but this is when she actually starts to do stuff. There's actually a hacker subplot that she tracks down. She's got like a little side feature in one of the issues. She's a lot more of a badass than I remember. She's not very jokey. She's very no nonsense and very serious. And at least I am right now really pushing for those two to eventually get back together, considering that there's nothing holding them back anymore, and that's part of why the other love interest just doesn't work, because there's easily better chemistry over here, and that other love interest even has like a jealous streak, and it just, I don't know, it seems like they're going very out of their way to put Tony with people that he shouldn't be with when it comes to Rhodey and his new girlfriend. Now, this run also has issue 300, where Tony gets the Modular Armor. And the Modular Armor is the armor I grew up with. It was the armor on the TV show. It was the armor in the comics when I was a kid. It's the armor I first read Iron Man in. In fact, my first Iron Man comic was Iron Man number 300. So there's an immense amount of nostalgia for that armor, and it's still probably my favorite armor. The Silver Centaurion is really creeping up as maybe my favorite, but this, I don't know, there's a lot of nostalgia attached here. There's a great Ultimo story for a couple of issues where Tony gets the armor, and it is still playing with that theme of what makes a person a person. Is it purpose? Is it logic? Is it rationality? Is it emotion? And the juggling action between those things is what's really the driving force here between characters and between Tony Stark and his Iron Man persona, because there is still a little bit of a battle in his mind going on of should he be Iron Man or should he be Tony, and what are the differences between those two, and those are themes we haven't really talked about since the first Michelini Layton run and the Dennis O'Neil run back in the late 160-ish era. And a lot of that actually comes to a head when you get Captain America and Tony, who have a conversation from issues 303 to 304. Essentially, Iron Man's going around and he's battling these very boring, very dull 90s creations. And in fighting these 90s creations, there's quite a lot of Tony just yelling at them for saying, like, look at you people are crazy, you're just bloodthirsty and angry and angsty for no reason, why were you even born, kind of thing. It's a very direct criticism of the way Marvel's 90s Marvel was handled. To make all of that work better, you have Tony in flashback talk to Steve Rogers, who at this point in his history has the super soldier serum wearing off on him. And they have this really great conversation about a couple of things. It's actually really, really layered stuff. And Tony has this line where he says, I made one mistake. I made one mistake, which was letting Stark International buy out Stark Enterprises buy out State International. And State International has been going through a whole bunch of illegal activity, and so Tony gets the blame for it. And Tony is slowly being as honest and as level-headed as possible in dealing with that situation, but everybody hates him. So Tony says, I do all of this good, I do all these great things in my life and in my company and try to be the best person possible. I make one mistake and suddenly everyone's my enemy. And Captain America says that people demand a great deal from their symbols. They don't like being disappointed. And he has this great line where he says, in a time when big corporations seemed like the enemy of the common man, they looked to you for proof that it didn't have to be that way. And that's great. The fact that Captain America understands Tony better than he does. And they kind of mellow out the tension there. When Tony compares himself to being frozen in ice, back when he was in cryosleep, and they have a nice common ground there. And it's strange to see Captain America and Iron Man be so civil with each other, especially considering what's going on with the film universe right now. So that's just really great off the bat. They even have the next big conversation they have. The next part of that is Tony and Steve talking about the point of secret identities, and Steve Rogers saying that the symbol's more important than the man, and then Tony saying it's about the man's ability to become immortal. And they have a little bit of an in-between ground of, yes, by your actions of creating a symbol, you do become immortal, and so you have the same standing as the symbol, and they're both opposite sides of the same coin, and it's the kind of conversation I wish we would get in the Marvel films with Captain America and Iron Man, because I love the way they're played in the films. But I think this is a great example of their commonalities. We don't get a lot of Iron Man and Captain America discussions where it seems like they're on the same page. Even in their disagreements, they're on the same page, and that's what's really great about what we have here, where they're both so analytical about things. They're both so open to these different ideas and these different ways of looking at things. And Captain America at this point is looking for a successor because he's not sure if he can keep doing what he's doing. And the big thing Tony tells him is that he needs to focus on the little victories. And so you have like this discussion of like the macro point of heroism versus the micro self-fulfillment that comes from heroism, which is something that Tony's been dealing with for a while, where every time he decides to not become Iron Man, he realizes that the thrill of being Iron Man is too much for him, and at the same time, being consumed in what Iron Man's supposed to be is too much for him. And it's a great way to talk about both of those layers of who Tony Stark is versus who Iron Man is and what the gap is there. This also has a nice third arc, and I think Tony is a person that has three separate personalities. Like we already talked about with the Iron Man and the Tony Stark, but there's also the Anthony Stark business persona, and that's a really interesting combination of both, where he's able to appreciate the little victories in business but appreciate the grand overarching ideas of what business is supposed to be like. And in a story like this, you wish a character like Obadiah Stane could come back, but you can't after the end of Dennis O'Neill's run, and that's okay, because it's great to have a character created and then killed by the same writer for the sake of the story. But the business angle for Tony Stark is something that's really fascinating, and something we don't get a lot of still. Kaminski's Iron Man is just criminally underrated. It's some of the most fascinating stuff done with this character, and I think it's safe to say that it's the second best Iron Man run I've ever read, at least so far. Because the Dennis O'Neill stuff is still number one, but this is really creeping in as number two, and it gets better the more I talk about it. The last two things I want to mention is that Tony's cousin Morgan Stark is one of the through-line characters between the first batch of issues and this set of issues. And you don't really get a lot of superhero extended families. You just don't see that, even if the superhero never loses their parents. Or even if they do, you never get the mention of, well, yeah, your parents died, but what about your cousins or your aunts and uncles or any of your extended family? Were you just raised all by yourself? Was your family just completely a blank slate? And Tony actually has a cousin in this, and that's interesting that Tony still actually has a surrounding family outside of the fact that his parents are not alive anymore. And that's interesting. Morgan Stark's not the most developed or most interesting character. He's actually just kind of there as a plot device. But it's interesting that he exists at all. The last thing is, by the end of this particular set of issues, the Mandarin awakens from a coma, and he was put into a coma and lost both of his hands during the end of the Dragon Seed saga, when Iron Man channeled all of his power through the Mandarin's rings to take out all of the Fin Fang Foom dragons. And he was nursed back to health by this family, and when he wakes up, they think he's a king, and his hands start to regrow, and he's got these giant dragon claws, his hands, and now he's ready to go out and take on Iron Man again, and at the same time Rhodey's getting ready to have a war with Iron Man. So by the end of this, we're getting all the setup for the next set of issues, which is the Dragon Seed saga, which is the Hands of the Mandarin arc. Now, if you haven't read this particular set of issues is not collected in anything. You can't find them outside of just buying the issues, at least at the time of this recording. It could very well be that Marvel announces an epic collection that collect some of this material. But I really doubt it. I really wish they would, because Kaminski's Iron Man is just fantastic stuff. It's some of the best stuff the book's ever had. So next time when we talk about Iron Man, we'll do the Hands of the Mandarin, which will wrap up Kaminski's run. And thanks everybody for listening. I'm sorry if I rambled a little bit in this one. It's actually been a couple of weeks since I read this set of issues, so I'm a little bit scatterbrained and I had to look at my notes while doing this. But thanks everybody for watching. Let me know what you think in the comments, whether you agree or disagree, and then make sure to follow me on Twitter where I talk about anything and everything in 140 character bursts. Thanks everybody for watching, and I will see you next time.